I'm sure that most people here, and indeed outside, have heard the hunting argument, both for and against, ad nauseum, really. So that really everything that's been said about it is known. But there's one big part of the jigsaw puzzle that is missing, and that is, what effect has the Hunting Act actually had on the previous quarry species? And one important point is if the League and the RSPCA and I4 and others who campaigned for this law, which came in 2005, if they'd really thought that it had improved animal welfare, they would have done the research, they would have done some studies which shows that animal welfare, wild animal welfare, had indeed improved. And for all the money that's been spent on this law, and something approaching 30 million was spent trying to get it onto the statute book, God knows what has been spent since, including public money, all that would have been worth it in the mind of the public, because they would have said animal welfare has indeed improved. But the very fact they haven't done it speaks volumes. And that's what the project is about, to find out what the Hunting Act effect has actually been.
Now, Richard, you write for Shooting Times, and you wrote a rather good article the other day, which crystallised a lot of that. So what's your angle on this? Are you broadly supportive of Jim?
Yeah, very much so. I was asked to write an article actually for The Critic magazine, which is sort of slightly out of my comfort zone, is that it's a Londoner's savvy magazine rather than our usual muddy, dusty Shooting Times self. And very much within that, I was asked the same question that Jim has just said, that where this issue is. And one of the things I've noticed with my Shooting Times hat on is that if you look at the data from the BTO, British Trust for Ornithology, that they did their mammal survey, and you can almost plot from the moment that the hunting ban came into effect in 2005, that the fox population dropped. And then you confer that with the GWCT's bag return, and you see a rise in foxes getting shot. So therefore, that's not to say that the fox population now is in any dire threat, but I think what the thing that I really took on board was that there was the brakes, if you like, on fox control were taken off courtesy of the hunting ban, because the hunter, the fox hunter, was the greatest conservationist for the fox that there was. So therefore, this whole article about has the ban been good for the fox? Well, clearly not, because more of them die. Has it put them into jeopardy? No, but more of them die.
Okay, but well, Jim, I suppose the trouble is, Richard is kind of challenging you to prejudge the findings, what you're setting out to find. But it sounds to me like this isn't unaligned to what you expect to find.
Sorry, I missed that last word.
This isn't unaligned to what you expect to find. That generally speaking, quarry species have not done very well as a result of Tony Blair's hunting ban.
I think the point is that when you bring in something like the Hunting Act, you not only change actions of people, you change the way they view that species. We know that when the Hunting Act came in, thousands of hares, for example, were shot out in East Anglia as a direct result of that act, because coursing and certain forms of hare hunting had stopped. You know, Charlie, because we were with you for the Fieldsports Channel. We made a little film down in the West Country, and again, we're finding that the attitude towards the deer is changing, and there are things that now can be done, now can't be done, are harder to do, and it looks as though it's not in favour of improving the deer herds health-wise either. So there's subtle changes, and that's the point. But generally, I would make the statement that if you are going to change something, then know where you're going. And this is where the antis tend not to be able to explain their position. They're very good at what they dislike. They're not very good at telling you what they advocate.
Richard, I'd say that down in the West Country where I live, one of the unknown unknowns that came out of the hunting ban is not just the change in attitude towards animals, but the change in attitude towards each other. So suddenly the fox shooter becomes a more important person in the pub, and the fox hunter becomes a less important person. And you can walk into a West Country pub now and say, I got 20 last night, and if he goes, oh, well done. And so that is a change. Is that something which do you agree with that as a proposition, or is that completely sort of extraneous to the argument?
No, I think that's actually a very important thing. I'm from Suffolk. Yes, we have a couple of packs of foxhounds or trail hounds in the county, but I'm not from a hunting county. But when I lived in Leicestershire, which is the epitome of a hunting county, the thing I found there was the regard with which the fox was treated was phenomenal. Now, the question would always be, when you went into the pub, say, well, you've been out with today? Corn Friday, right, okay. Did they kill? And you go, no. And that was that. So, let's be perfectly honest. I'm not here to try and detract from shooting foxes. I shoot a lot of foxes. But I think that if you're looking for... This is about animal welfare. And if you're thinking about the welfare of an animal, you usually have to regard that animal with if not love, certainly a sense of reverence, of regard. And I think probably what the fox, on that day in 2005 when the Hunting Act came in, that reverence and regard was parked. And that was moved over there. And most of us now, we're thinking, shot the bugger. That's what we're now thinking, whereas it used to be, God, it gave us a good run.
So we've seen to have lost respect. Can I just say, what I love about your spaniel, which is sitting just here, is that to begin with, whenever you said the word fox, and then it caught sight of you up there, and it couldn't believe that there was you there and you up there.
I know, it's probably the same thing for all the people out there going, my God, look at the size of his head.
Now your spaniel solved it all by falling asleep. Jim, are we talking about are you going to end up talking about a sense of respect for the animal, or is that too nebulous? Are you trying to find something more kind of scientifically evidential to be able to present to Parliament and say, look, this act has not worked, we need to change it?
I think it's at two levels. First of all, I think, as Richard has said, if an animal is to be killed in whatever process you are taking part, then there should be a degree of respect for it, and generally that's what I find from both the shooting world as well as the hunting world. But I would. This is not going to be a scientific project. A scientific project would probably take 3 years. Goodness knows how much money, probably 6 figures. And it would be quite difficult to do. It's important, I think, to do it. Nothing seems to be in the pipeline like it, and it's important to do it now, because doing it 2 years after the Hunting Act would have been too soon. Doing it 30 years after the Hunting Act is too late, and so I think it's something that needs to be done now. But in a wider spectrum, this act, if you like, it was one of the first times an animal rights thinking campaign had been put into practice.
Sorry, just explain that.
Well, the people behind it were thinking more in animal rights terms rather than animal welfare terms. And here we now have a law that reflects that. And if anyone thinks that they can regard this and hail it as a great piece of legislation, a step forward, as some in the Labour Party tend to do, and a lot of animal rights people do, they think it's a major milestone, then if we can show that it hasn't worked, that may very well be a useful indication for politicians in particular who are thinking of going down the same route. That we've got the Hunting Act, now let's go for certain forms of shooting. It's ironic that when the Hunting Act was going through, shooting was the humane alternative. Now hunting's gone, then they're turning their attentions onto shooting.
Well, you'd never believe they think of doing that. Richard, you're nodding.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, is that this was an animal rights bill. In fact, I'm going to have to quote from my book here, because Daniel Greenberg, who was the QC who actually wrote this legislation for the government.
Can you just explain when legislation comes out, what happens?
So when the legislation comes out, you have to get a very highfalutin lawyer who can essentially enshrine in law whatever bill is passed. Now that might be anything and everything, has to get a team of lawyers, and Daniel Greenberg happens to be one who is regularly resorted to from the government, because he is such a meticulous and intricate man, so that other clever lawyer cannot go and stumble over the legislation. They don't find a loophole, because there is no loophole to find.
Is he by any chance a card-carrying member of the Pytchley?
Well, no. He is, funnily not, he's an Orthodox Jew who said rather wonderfully, he said, I have no skin in this game. And yet, he does like the works of R.S. Surtees. So he gave a talk this Christmas to the R.S. Surtees Society, and via Zoom, of course, due to social distancing. And one of the things he said about when he drafted the Hunting Act was, what troubled me was the fact that for the first time in my professional experience, the mechanism of law was being deployed not to further some public policy objective, but to inflict on the whole country the moral perspective of the 600 or so citizens who happened to find themselves in the House of Commons at that time. So in other words, he has highlighted, the man who was forced to write this, that he wrote a law which was essentially to go and assuage the R factor of certain animal rights leaning politicians, and, as we know, Dennis Skinner, when he left the House of Commons after the bill had been passed, pointed at some claret-faced old Tory backbenchers and went, that's for the miners. And you also had Greenberg saying that this is essentially nothing more than a law about pearl clutching, and that we don't really like hunting and we don't like toffs on horseback. And this is the man who wrote it. So I don't think it can be any clearer. But exactly as Jim said, the worry for me is that this was probably the test case. Can we do this? They've now got their ire on the red coats. They're put over there. It's now time to turn to tweed. And I think we've got to be, in the shooting world, very mindful of that.
Sure, you're talking about two different things. I mean, you've got the animal rights fundamentalists who want to ban pet ownership, so that manual goes.
Yes.
But you also have, as you identified, a group of backbench MPs who wanted to beat up the Tories over the miners' strike. You have a very well-funded campaign from Jim's former employer, and you have a public that kind of doesn't really care very much and is prepared to let the whole thing go through.
Yes.
So I mean, you're not going to get that second part again unless you're very unlucky, aren't you?
I would say, actually, that we used to say that as long as we've got a Conservative government in, we'll be fine. Now, this is my own personal view.
Read the manifestos.
Well, exactly. I think that you can see already with the animal sentience bill is that there is certainly some power behind the throne who, again, are more looking at, they're mixing up animal welfare with animal rights. And, I mean, Jim's much better briefed on this particular thing than I, but I can see that. I can see that in how the new ELMS, the Environmental Land Management Scheme, is being drafted, is that they're not thinking about farmers with this. They're not thinking about the 70% who own that land. They're actually thinking about that landowners are not pleasant. And this is the sad fact, is this is a Conservative government who's thinking this. It seems to be across the board, is that the old has gone, the new has come in, and we have lost our allies in Parliament to a greater degree, I think.
Well, perhaps it's a good thing we have to now win on the evidence. But Jim, let's talk about that. So I want to know why this government has got hung up, has decided to hang itself up on the word sentience when they could have chosen empathy or consciousness or any number of other words. and what the consequences of choosing sentience will mean, not just for us who work with wildlife, but for the government who's trying to play philosopher?
I tend to think that the government is making a rod for its own back, and it should really pull this bill and rethink it. For those that are probably wondering why it's come in, a few years ago when Brexit occurred, there was a transfer of EU laws into British law, and in EU laws the word sentience appeared. It didn't appear in our laws, and we've had animal welfare laws for years, ever since 1822. But the word sentience didn't appear, and we had ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous headlines in the Standard and in the Independent and from one or two Labour MPs who said that the government is saying that animals don't suffer, that they don't feel pain. And I'm afraid the government buckled. And that's why we've got this thing called the Animal Sentience Bill. It's a very short bill. What it does is it creates a committee, and of course a lot hangs on that. Who will be on it, how much power it has, how wide its remit is, and it will mean that every piece of legislation that the government passes has to go through this committee, and they have to assess any animal welfare effect that may occur as a result. And I can tell you now that even at the beginning of this process, the animal welfare groups themselves, the animal rights groups, didn't always know exactly where this was going to lead, because, as one of them said, well, does this mean that if we choose to go to war, there has to be some sort of assessment as to not the people that may be killed, but the animals that may be killed? And no one knew an answer to it. So really, I would stress that this is a very unnecessary piece of legislation. It provides another layer of bureaucracy, and of course in doing that it provides an opportunity for people, who am I thinking of, Chris Packham, Mark Avery, to bring in judicial reviews and just delay things. We've seen it with the badger cull. We saw a similar sort of tactic with the general licences, and all this does is it provides another layer of bureaucracy for judicial reviews to take place.
I just want to stay with Jim for a sec, because on the kind of the pragmatics of this, 3 or 4 years ago, Michael Gove entertained the word sentience, realised he had dug himself into a hole, dropped it, and moved on. And he had a very good PR person at the time called Sarah Sands who helped him out of that particular hole. Now George Eustace has picked this word up and has been told to march slowly towards the enemy, carrying this word. I mean, it seems to me to be political suicide for anybody who will be known as the one who tried to introduce sentience as law.
Well, sentience isn't at question here. There's no one thinks that animals aren't sentient. It's a ridiculous accusation to make. But when anything that the government wants to do that could affect animals that obviously are sentient has to be looked at, and a lot depends on how this committee is going to operate, who's on it, what new ideas they are introducing. You can imagine how difficult it might be. I mean, from the general license point of view, from the badger cull point of view, from general wildlife management point of view, it's not as if somehow we are discussing these things from an animal point of view, because all of these actions have been through Parliament, and indeed new bills will go through Parliament, and they'll go through parliamentary scrutiny. So you've got to ask the question, what is the point of this law?
Well, they've already drawn a line and said that invertebrates are not sentient, which is a pretty savage ruling if you're an octopus or a lobster. Richard, you're a wordsmith. If you had, supposing you were a politician and you were given this brief, I mean, and you found all the doors were locked, how would you make sentience work?
I like to think I'm a wordsmith, but I think I'd probably leave that to my sub-editor, actually, to go and make
that
some
is such
sense.
A cop-out.
Okay, I suppose the way the how does one go, and I don't think it's very easy, because I'm a firm believer that in politics, cuddling babies has been shown to be such a dangerous thing that now it's better to cuddle an animal, and whether that is metaphorically speaking or not. So therefore, to actually try and create a law around animal welfare very frequently morphs very quickly into animal rights. So I think to try and enshrine something as sentient, I mean, it was one of the reasons why the Hunting Act was so ridiculously hard to go and actually justify in any shape or form, because the Hunting Act, when they had the research beforehand, Burns' report said that the fox's welfare was affected negatively by hunting. But that's exactly the self-same thing as saying that Christmas negatively affects the welfare of turkeys. He then went on in his second sentence to go and say, but if you ask me the direct question, is hunting cruel? My answer is no. But this sentience thing is actually looking at that first part. They're saying, does this affect the welfare? And they're using the word welfare and giving it an animal rights spin. And so I think I am going to pass that, because if I had any sway with anybody, I'd go back to old Greenberg and say, listen, Mr. Eustace, we're going to park this one because it ain't going to work. But thankfully, I'm not writing speeches for politicians.
It does sound more like a law than a hostage, more like a hostage situation than a law. Yes, Jim.
I was going to say, I have a feeling that there's a little bit of a conflict here between George Eustace and a certain Carrie, and I think he'd like to hang on to his job, and maybe this is a way of doing it. That's a very cynical way of looking at it.
It's a very brave move. Can I take you a little bit forward in time? I mean, I know we're here to talk about the effects of the Hunting Act, but there's a great deal to be learned already from the Hunting Act that could be applied to the current situation. And one of the things that worry me in the Conservative manifesto, which they want to enact, which has the backing, almost cross-party backing, is an Office for Environmental Protection. So you have a committee under animal sentience which applies sentience to the legal structure, and then you have a police force for anybody who's involved with wildlife. Now that means us, and police forces are judged on arrest rates, broadly speaking. So are we about to be cracked down upon?
If that's for me, I really don't know, because I don't recognise some of the things coming through as being from what I would have thought was the traditional Conservative Party. I think some of their environmental targets are, well, if they're achieved, it'll be a miracle. But it will cost so much. I mean, people duck this question when you talk about replacement of ordinary cars with electric cars, with gas boilers into electric boilers. This is going to be really expensive. And look at the situation we're in at the moment with the economy. We're trying to dig ourselves out of something which, no one could have foreseen just 2 years ago. And yet we've got these targets which are fast approaching. And I really do wonder who's driving this. I don't get it.
Are you going to reach a conclusion at the end of your review into the hunting ban that there is a financial cost to all of this, or are you going to? I mean, welfare has been your life's work. Animal welfare has been your life's work. Are you going to stick to anecdotes about animal welfare?
It's very hard to. I don't want to prejudge it. I want to talk to people around the country to say this is what our experience is. This is why it's not going to be a scientific piece of research. It'll be people at the coalface, if you like, their experiences. And whilst people will say, well, it's not scientific, you can't hold it up as a scientific piece of research. Well, at least we've done something, and I hope that we have a better idea. But I hope also that it makes politicians think that going down a route that may sound very attractive, that looks good on your CV or your election address, isn't necessarily the best route.
And if people want to get involved in this in any way, how do they do that? Have you got a website?
They could contact me through the through the Countryside Alliance, and
They can come and find you today.
I've got some copies of what we're trying to do. Certainly could do that, or even contact you, Charlie, and you can put them,
I'll send on any messages.
emails and things like that. We did that little film with you on the Fieldsports Channel, which we were very pleased about. So there are ways of getting in contact with if you want to be part of that, or indeed if you have a story to tell, if something has happened in your area that you feel should be exposed, explained, then we'd love to hear from you.
And Richard, if you want people to read your articles, where do they look?
Well, the one on this particular topic is in the Critic magazine, which I think you have to sort of either live in London or have a PhD in cleverness to go and get that, or otherwise in the Shooting Times. I'm going to write my next country diary specifically around Jim's research, so we'll sort of, and I will keep an eye on it, because I think it's a fascinating thing, because I am 100% certain that the hunting ban is the writing on the wall for shooting, and we have an opportunity now to look at where the mistakes were made by various organisations, by various individuals, and say we're not going to repeat that, because if we sleepwalk back into the same situation, then I'm afraid shooting is going to be as stuffed as hunting.
Richard, Jim, thank you very much indeed for joining me and explaining that.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Richard Negus, Jim Barrington.